Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. The wonderful David Marx joining us today, talking about everyone's favorite topic, Adobe Lightroom. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about turning your sunset and sunrise photos into spectacular works of art via this great, powerful editing app. So I'd like to welcome you on, David. Pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, thanks, y'all. Thanks so much for having me back. It's a pleasure. When I was here last, I talked about shooting sunrise and sunset photos. So I'm loving that I get a chance to kind of follow that up with what do I do when I get home. Thank you so much to everyone for joining me this afternoon and the folks at B&H for putting this on. What I have for you today, I have a little Lightroom demo. And what I think I'll do, if it's okay, in a minute here, I'll stop the broadcast in my face, turn over to my screen, run through some examples, pause for a little bit, take a couple questions, carry on, and then try and answer the rest of the questions at the end. Let me, if it's all right, let me share my screen here.
They are definitely here to see you and not me, David, so I'm all for it.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's see, hopefully at this point you're seeing Chrome or a web browser?
Yep, got Chrome
all right
now.
So first, the little shameless self-promotion part. My name's David Marx. You can find me online at a couple different websites, but for Lightroom type content, I teach at a website called focuspphotoschool.com. And so almost every button control thing that I'm going to push today, I cover in some long video here at my own website. In the pre-pandemic world, I used to teach live photography classes for a number of different groups, including the Rocky Mountain School of Photography in Missoula, Montana, a longtime partner with B&H. Also teach for a company called Glacier Photo Guides. These are some of the places workshop-wise I would have gone. If you're looking for more of my content, social media-wise, on YouTube, you'll find me at focuspphotoschool.com. That's my channel. And then on Instagram, I'm David Marx Photo. So all pretty easy to find. But none of that's why I hope you tuned in today. What I hoped you tuned in today for is advice on how I fine-tune my sunrise and sunset photos using Adobe Lightroom. Now, before I get rolling, I need to make it clear that there are two very different types of Lightroom product at this point. There is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom Classic, which is what I hope you're seeing on the screen right now. There's also a product called Adobe Lightroom. The big difference between the two is where your photos get stored. With Lightroom Classic, your images are stored on your own hard drive, or hard drives plural, but something connected to your physical computer. With the Adobe Lightroom product, your photos are stored on Adobe servers. If you're brand new here, and if you have no background already in the Adobe software world, I really think that the cloud-based type of Lightroom, what's called Adobe Lightroom plain old, makes a lot of sense. It frees you from the photo storage problem of buying more hard drives. Apologies to B&H, who I've bought thousands of dollars worth of hard drives from. It frees you from the fear of what happens if this computer gets lost, destroyed. And it just, like, the idea of cloud storage, I think, is super elegant and modern, but it's not what I expect much of the audience is used to seeing, those with a background in Lightroom Classic. So today, I'm going to demo in Lightroom Classic. 90+% of what I do today is available in the other program. And I'll try and point out the couple of buttons or knobs here that the cloud-based type of Lightroom doesn't have. Anyway, so today's presentation is all about how I fine-tune my sunrise and sunset photos, because I'm a landscape travel photographer. That's what I love to do. So I've broken this up into sort of a couple of sections. The idea being that I think about my workflow, what I intend to do, sort of in a A to B to C, a linear progress. And the first thing that I think about is what in my sunrise, sunset, landscape photo needs to be repaired. Well, when it comes to repair, the most common problem, the one that we all have, whether you're an amateur or a professional, whether you have a point and shoot camera or the fanciest camera that B&H sells, we all have the problem of dust. We live in a dusty, dirty world. In fact, here, I hope, on the screen, you're seeing some big, horrible dust spots, all sorts of just gunk that was either stuck to the end of my lens or inside the camera on the sensor. Dust problems are a universal. I hope someday that our cameras will clean this out for us, but they don't. That said, if you have a beautiful photo like this sunset coast of Maine, and you have some dust spots, it's nothing to cry over. In any type of Lightroom, frankly, in most any image repair program, we're going to have some type of dust removal tool. In Lightroom, it's this little symbol here. We click on this. Oops, let me turn that off for a second. We have two different dust removal modes, but for our purposes, healing is just fine. And basically the process is this. We put the cursor, this little ring right here, over a dust spot. We tap the mouse, and what it does is it copies and pastes. It basically is like Chutes and Ladders. If you remember the little kids game, it copies this circle of pixels here, slides it down the arrow, and pastes it right there. And if it does this well, a bit of blue sky covers a flaw in the blue sky, totally invisible. When you have something like this hair, instead of just tapping, you can actually paint out a little line so that it'll copy more of an oblong shape than just a circle. Well, I bet this is old news to a lot of you. Obviously, I could sit here and tap away all afternoon. That would be frightfully dull to watch. But I want to show you one or two little secrets to dust removal that are not as obvious. In Lightroom, there is a button down here on the toolbar called Visualize Spots. And what this does is it turns on this black and white overlay where if you adjust the throttle, the threshold, this guy here, it can be really obvious where your dust spots are. Do you see these little sort of black and white donut shapes? That's the shape of a dust spot. It has a sort of a telltale signature. Now, there are other things, fibers, hairs that can get stuck to our lens. But if you turn this on and off, you'll see the dust like you wouldn't believe. And now we can just zap them and zap them and zap them. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is often just looking visually, in full color, you might miss something. The other one that I wanted to point out, let me just zoom out here for just a second. The other one I wanted to point out is how folks look for dust. Often we kind of zoom in the middle, we might scroll around a little and we say perfectly clean. Well, not sadly true. What we really want to do, and I'm going to open up this window here called the navigator, is we want to start in like the top left corner. And we want to work our way all the way down, say, one column, then up and over and down again. And if you work your way from top left to bottom right through the whole photo, you'll get every dust spot. That problem will be done, and we can move on to more exciting stuff in life. So that's what I'm going to do now. But the first thing I would urge you when working on your sunset, sunrise photos, they all have a lot of sky. The sky shows off this kind of problem. Clean it up, be done with it. Okay. Moving to a more interesting and faster type of repair. Along with dust, there are flaws that are introduced by our camera lenses. So here, I'm using a 45 millimeter lens or a 35 to 350 at the 45 setting. And at first, you won't see the obvious flaw. But if I zoom in here over this dock at sunset here in Montana, and I'm going to zoom way in, do you see, I hope, a purple stripe on one side of the dock and a green stripe on the other? This fringing, this is a problem called chromatic aberration. Basically, as light passes through a plate of glass, it does the prism thing, the mirror effect. And so as the light does its little prismatic thing, the wavelengths of light scatter and they hit our camera sensor slightly out of alignment. So we get these fringes, sometimes green, purple, sometimes blue, yellow. Well, fortunately, the brilliant folks at Adobe in all their different Lightroom and Photoshop products have come up with a way to fix this flaw most of the time. And all it takes is turning on this simple remove chromatic aberration switch, because what they've really done here is created the appearance of a better lens than what I actually own. The lens that I have doesn't, it's not that clean. This is a flaw in the lens. Well, let me show you another similar variety. Oh, one last thing before I do. To find the chromatic aberration, it helps if you look at something that ought to be a nice clean edge along the side of your photo. If you're looking smack in the middle, you probably won't see it. The lens ought to be really good in the center, but we get more and more of this flaw out to the side. Also, you could search down here in the lake all you want, but you'd never see it because all we have there are blue pixels. We need that edging effect. So here, I'll show you another type of lens flaw. This is out on the coast of Maine. And what we have here is the hood of the lens casting a shadow in these four corners. It's created vignetting. There is, I should add, chromatic aberration. It's pretty small and faint, but you can see that green fringe right there. So I'm going to turn on the remove chromatic aberration. That's going to take away the fringing. But now this vignetting, for that, I'm going to turn on this switch that says enable profile correction within the lens panel in Lightroom. And what this is going to do is it's going to fix some of the shadow that my lens cast and some of the geometric distortion, the pincushion effect. And so we get, again, a better image, a more optically precise image than this Canon lens actually gave me. And I don't mean to bash Canon here. This is a Canon L lens, the 24-105. Beautiful lens, one of the many happy purchases I've made over the years, one of the thousands of, hundreds of thousands of dollars I've spent at B&H, but all lenses have optical flaws. So this, a better image than I would have got. Show you one more quick example of this, where the vignetting is really, really noticeable. This time with a 16-35, again, Canon L glass, but all lenses, especially zoom lenses, are going to have some aberration. We would see that if I zoomed in over the tree. And they're going to have some vignetting where the body of the lens casts a shadow on what gets in through the front element to hit the sensor. So I'll turn this on, and you can see how here the shadow, the corners really light up compared to before. Along the same lines, we have this geometric distortion thing. Now, in this case, it's not just the lens. And in fact, there is chromatic aberration here along these window edges. I'll turn that on. There's distortion, vignetting from the lens. But the biggest problem with this photo is not the lens, but me, the use of the lens. If you're a professional architecture photographer, you wouldn't shoot a hotel lobby like this with a super wide angle lens, a 24 mm lens, because it causes this bowing. You can see how the columns run. They're kind of falling over, like leaning out to the side. Well, that geometric distortion problem in the Lightroom world, they've broken that out from lens correction and put it in an area called transform. Here we can do this manually. I'll show you that in just a second here. And here there are some algorithms, auto correction buttons that will try and straighten up those walls for me. I'm just going to hit auto in this case, and you'll see how the pillars, the walls, are now nice and vertical. Before, building is falling over in like a weird out to the side way. After, nice and straight, but it comes at a price. And that's why I wanted to show this image. You see the white space here? To straighten this guy up, to squeeze it to be vertical again, I have to distort it. I have to pinch it and bend it here so it no longer fills the rectangle. The point is, if you do this, it comes at a price. And so to make it rectangular, I'm going to turn on this constrained crop. When I do that, though, it's going to cut out some of the detail at the bottom to fit into a rectangle again. Well, I know today's class and talk is on sunrise, sunset, and landscape, not architecture photography, but I think this makes what this button does more obvious. Let me move to a landscape. Here, This is North Cascades National Park, beautiful place over in Washington. This is pretty typical sunrise type landscape photography to me. I could press one of these auto buttons. I, of course, can fix the flaws in the lens. I do that basically every photo. But this time I want a little more control. And that's what these transform vertical, horizontal sliders will do for me. So in this case, I'm going to take the vertical pinch slider and I'm going to pull it myself. You'll see it has the same problem with what we saw a minute ago, that the more I pivot it, the more I'd have to cut something away. Let me just reset this just so you can see the pinch. But what's cool here, and the reason I'm emphasizing this, is when I photograph something like this with mountains, buildings, trees, I want them to stand up nice and straight. Well, my wide angle lens, what I usually shoot sunrise and sunset with, that's going to fight against me. So by using the transform, I can take something where the wide angle lens was pushing the world back in vertical space, and I can make it a little closer to what the human eye would see, something like this. I use these dust removal, lens correction, transform on pretty much every sunrise and sunset photo. To me, they're the bare bones beginning of what I need to do. One last here, though. It's really easy to fall in love with these controls, but I want to point out that they don't always work for us. In this case, I've got this beautiful lighthouse on the coast of Maine. I go up there and teach every year. When I try to make the lighthouse vertical, though, because the wide angle lens, it's making it fall back in space. When the lighthouse gets to about vertical, we have a problem. The problem is I didn't have enough space, so I have to cut off the top of the lighthouse. So I want you to learn these controls, love these controls, but I don't want you to hear this as a substitute for using the best equipment you can, whether that's a tripod and getting it level, a tilt shift lens, a longer lens rather than a wider lens. The better the image you bring home, the less of it we have to cut away. And in the case of the dust spots, the cleaner the image, the less we have to waste all day spotting and spotting and spotting. So part one to me of landscape photography improvements is the stuff we have to fix. Part two is the global image repair stuff, what I consider the big picture. And so here, what I mean is fixing the overall image, not one specific area, but the overall stuff. So there are different categories in here as well of global repair. The first category will be for those of you who are shooting in RAW. And I have to say, for our landscape type work, RAW is definitely going to be more advantageous than JPEG. If your camera gives you the choice, and if you have either type of Lightroom Classic, what I'm in right now, or the cloud-based, that RAW file, it's more malleable, more flexible. It gives you more leeway in the type of changes to the brightness, the color, the contrast that we're likely to make. And the first place that we might see that in Lightroom is what they call the camera raw profile. Big fancy word, kind of scary. What it really means is the base interpretation of color and contrast. So think of this list like different films for those with a background in film. Think of this as like a standard film, a high contrast, high saturation film, a neutral film, a portrait film. Well, let me show you a couple of differences here. These are going to be subtle. This is the base color. This is a much more vivid color. Let me zoom in here, and I'm going to split my screen so you can see a side by side, perhaps. This ought to be a more vivid color. I know it's kind of blurry, but I'm super zoomed in than this. Or this ought to be much less vivid, much more neutral. This would be, say, a black and white film loaded in the camera. So the first decision I make when working on my image is what starting point do I want to use? For this, something like landscape or something like vivid, it's going to add color punch. It's going to add saturation. It's going to give me just a little snappier starting point. Same thing here. I just want to emphasize that I could start and usually do with something like landscape. That's going to make my colors a little punchier or vivid, but there are also options in here for more creativity. In fact, if I click browse, there's a whole long list of other profiles, presets, other black and white looks. Again, the idea being that these are places your photo could start. They're not the end all be all. They may not be everything, but they're an option. I'll just show you a completely different one. I could pick something like this to begin with a very different set of colors. I think you'll see the yellow leaves turn orange than I might have had in the camera. Sometimes to make our sunrise, sunset photos really shine, starting with a different film is a great way to get going. So in all of the photos I'm going to show from here on, I've gone ahead, I've zapped the dust, I've fixed the lens problems, and I've picked my film type, my profile. Next category of global repair would be the white balance, the color of the image. In this case, I'm at the same lighthouse, coast of Maine. I'm on the other side of it. It's getting on to twilight, but it's not this blue, right? This looks kind of underwater to me. The problem here is I had turned off auto white balance in my camera, and I had gotten the manual white balance setting wrong. In fact, if you're curious what I'd done, I had set the camera to tungsten for some reason. I don't know why. I'm not a very bright person. I don't know what I was thinking, believing that the world is illuminated by a giant tungsten or halogen light bulb. But the result was the wrong colors in my photo. What I need here is something closer to the way the world actually looks. Well, if I had left the camera on auto, I would have gotten something closer to this. Otherwise, I might have picked one of those other settings in the camera, something like daylight, a little bit cooler, something like cloudy, a little bit warmer. It's this flexibility in color. This is one of the places where the raw file is really advantageous. Anyway, here, to make this sunset photo look right, I need to fix the overall color of the whole image. I'll show you one from closer to home. This is from Glacier National Park. This is maybe 20 miles from me. I have no complaints with the composition, the photo, but it just doesn't have a cold, icy, frozen winter feel that I'm really looking for. Now, I could try auto, but I don't know, that seems too blue to me. So what I'm going to do is take the temperature slider, and the way to read that as cool blue to the left, warm yellow to the right, and I'm just going to slide this myself until I have like a late twilight, icy blue mood, but not over the top exaggerated. I think somewhere about there, let me show this to you side by side. This is a little too warm in our white balance, in our color temp. This feels like the right mood. Make sense? So these controls, the type of film, the white balance, they're the beginning of Lightroom Classic's basic panel. In the other type of Lightroom, this is in the color panel, and this is in a section called light, but all the same controls are there. So the next section down, that's about the brightness or the contrast in our image. And to help us along here, let me just hop over to a little talk on histograms. If you're curious, the histogram is this area up here in Lightroom. It's in your camera. It's in all sorts of programs. And I think the histogram is really useful when we're photographing and when we're processing our images. And basically, the histogram is a bar graph that shows the exposure, meaning how many pixels do we have of black, white, gray, dark gray, medium gray on a graph. It has an x-axis along the bottom, has a y-axis along the side, so a vertical axis, a horizontal axis. The x-axis is how bright are the pixels. The y-axis is how many of them do we have. So look at, here's what the y-axis shows. The y-axis is a scale from inky black, medium gray, paper white. This thing right here, this gray bar, from black to gray to white. If you can cut this out and put this visually underneath this, that's what's really going to help you. Because this is what it's going to show us, that in this pretend histogram, we have, say, very few pixels of inky black. We have very few pixels of paper white. We have lots of pixels at about light gray. This is very helpful when we're out there in the field photographing. It lets us know if we've blown something out or blocked it up. It's also very, very useful when we get home. So just to go back a second, this would be example in the field, if you're seeing this on your camera, of what's usually an underexposed image. You have thousands and thousands of pixels over by pure black. This would be an example of an overexposed image, thousands and thousands of pixels at pure white. This would be an ideal exposure, not perhaps real, but out in the field, the perfect exposure where we didn't lose any highlights, we didn't lose any shadows. Well, when we get home, this is what we're usually looking for when we're processing our image. Because if our histogram doesn't extend from black to white, we basically get a foggy, flat, minimal variation in tone kind of image. So this would be minimal variation. This would be maximum tonal variation. Let me show you two quick examples and we'll put this into practice. Here, the image feels perhaps veiled, muted, murky. And if we look at its histogram, there's some dead space here and some dead space there. Well, using Lightroom or whatever imaging processing software, I'm going to take this, what my camera captured, and I'm going to extend the darks and lights to that. So we fill the tonal range. Let me show this to you in practice here. Give me 1 second. Okay, so here we have a black and white image. I think it's easiest at first to think of this in black and white. And if we look at its histogram, basically this is medium gray. So we have light gray to dark gray, but no inky black and no paper white. Well, in the Lightroom world, I can take this overall exposure slider and I can crank it up to make the whole photo brighter or all down to make it darker. But what I'm really looking for is to move the ends more than the middle. And that's where these blacks, whites, shadows, highlights controls come in. If I take the black slider and pull it down, I'm moving this end more than I'm moving that end. And so I can get these to be about inky black. If I take the white slider and drag it up, I can move the right end, the bright end of the graph, up to about paper white. And just by moving those two controls, just by expanding the histogram all the way out, I go from this flat, veiled, muted, murky, to this, much more three-dimensional, because now it has a bright highlight and an inky black shadow. Let me show you the same exact thing, same photo, but in full color. So in color, ignore the blue, the purple histograms back there. Focus just on the silver one. I'm going to take that black slider. I'm going to drag it down to about there. I'm going to take the white slider. I'm going to push it up to about there. If I want, I can adjust these others, but for now, I don't even need to. Look at how much richer and more vibrant, crisper, more three-dimensional the after is. This is before, after. Okay, so again, I know this class is on sunrise and sunset. Let's see it in action. Well, here's a beautiful foggy sunrise here in Montana. My histogram goes from like darkish gray to lightish gray, but it doesn't go from black to white. So I'm going to bring this black slider down. Now, to add a little precision to what I'm doing, there's a secret key in Lightroom. In Lightroom, I'm going to hold down the Alt key on a PC, the Alt Option key on a Mac. So I'll hold Alt, and when I do that and click on the black slider, holding Alt Option with one finger, the screen's going to go completely white. The reason this is helpful is now, as I drag the slider down, we'll be able to see when pure black appears in this image. Those spots on the screen now, those are the pure black pixels. So let me just back this up. So I have just a couple of inky black pixels about there. If you look now, the silver part of my histogram comes right up to the edge. Let me do the same trick. I'm going to hold the Alt key, Alt option on a Mac. I'm going to click on the white slider. The screen's going to go completely black. And now as I slide this up, when I start to get colored pixels, that's when I've gotten to paper white. So let me back that off to just about there. Okay, just moving those two sliders has taken our image from what you see on the left, really murky, to what we have now on the screen here. The other two controls, or other controls, the shadows and the highlights, they allow us to work on these in-between tones. Shadows brings out darker details. Highlights suppresses the almost paper white stuff. So by moving this down a little and this up a little, maybe I'll massage the overall image like this, I can go from this photo, very muted, to this photo in no time. I really want to harp on the importance of this in our sunrise, sunset, landscape type photos. So let me show you one more example of this. Here we have a perfectly fine photo out on the coast of Maine. Its histogram in the field when I shot it goes from almost inky black to almost paper white, but it's not perfect. So what I'm going to do, my sort of overall process, I'm going to zap the dust spots. I'm going to fix the problems with the lens. I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to pick the type of film that I wish I'd had, something like landscape. Then I'm going to carefully move the blacks. And in this case, we already have some almost inky blacks in the shadows. So maybe I move these only a tiny bit rather than as far as I moved them last time. I'm going to check on the whites. Let's go until we have something almost paper white. So that would be too far. Back just a little. I'm going to move the in-betweens, the shadows, and the highlights, and I'm going to season to taste as needed with the exposure and the contrast. Overall, I think this looks great. Maybe I'll shift the color a little bit cooler blue since it was late in the day. Something about like this. So the exposure, the brightness of the photo, the color of the photo, the type of film I wish I'd started with gives us from this what the original raw file looked like, what the camera saw, to this. Perfect. One more variation on this. So there are three axes, if you will, that we might repair the overall image on. One axis is the white balance. How blue is it? How yellow is it? Another axis or avenue of repair would be the brightness. How bright is it? How dark is it? The third avenue would be the level of punch to our colors, the intensity, what we would call the saturation. Well, in Lightroom's basic panel, we have these two controls, vibrance and saturation. As this goes up, the colors grow punchier. The reds don't become anything other than red, but they move from pastel red to fire engine red to neon. Vibrance is very similar, same idea, different algorithm, from pastel colors to neon colors. The problem is these two controls, they move the entire rainbow, the reds, the greens, the yellows, the full spectrum. Well, rarely do I want all the colors in my image to go to neon or nuclear, but I love the idea of intensifying some of the colors. In Lightroom, both Lightroom Classic, what's on the screen now, and the other type of Lightroom, there's an additional area, the hue, saturation, luminance panel. But for now, it's the saturation part that I'm interested in. Instead of changing everything, now I have controls just for the red pixels. Now, I'm not telling it just red flowers. Watch the flag up there as well. I'm saying all the red parts. But in this case, all the reds need to be a lot more neon, a lot more vibrant, punchy, because they're the strong subject in the beginning. Here in this photo, I might take down the greens, take down the yellows a little. I might bump up the blues so they counteract or balance my reds up there in the sky. I'm going to flick this little light switch on and off so you can see just the difference from adjusting the saturation before, as the camera saw it, after. So I see in the Q&A, there's a question about what happens if you start with a JPEG file. The only thing you would lose here is this raw profile, and you wouldn't have as much flexibility in how far you can pull these controls before things look chunky or crack a little. It's not that anything is disabled. It's just that you don't have the full flexibility of a digital camera raw file. And let's move to the fun part. So the fun part is the local improvements to our photos. When we're out in the field photographing, used to be we would use these graduated neutral density filters to darken down the sky when shooting a sunset photo. For those who aren't familiar, basically they would look something like this in front of your camera. B&H sells these. I got to say they're endlessly frustrating, but I still buy them. I use them. I love them. Well, let me say that again. I hate them when I'm using them, but I love the results. The reason I use them in the field, the reason I've bought them for years now, is because they allow us to change the top part of a landscape photo like this without changing the bottom part. And let me see if I can make this make sense to you here. This is without any filter in front of the lens. This is a sunrise in the Alps. I would love for my sky to look like that. That's the way the eye saw it. Dark, high contrast, high color. The problem is if I push the whole photo that way, I lose all this detail in the shadows of the mountains. For the mountains, I want it brighter so I get this detail in the glaciers and the mountain peaks. But of course, the brighter image loses that detail in the sky. So this is what I mean by not a global repair, but a local repair, where we do something here, but not there. Well, in Lightroom, we have 3 local tools. We have the graduated filter. I think that's the landscape photographer's best friend. We have a radial filter, very similar, but it's going to work inside a circle, and a brush tool. Talk about the brush in a second. The way that the graduated filter works is when I tap on this, a whole nother panel appears. The other type of Lightroom has this tool as well, I should say. It's not just Lightroom Classic. Now, this time, when I move these sliders, at first, nothing's going to happen because what I'm doing here is telling it what I want it to do. That's part 1, but I haven't done part 2 yet. Where do I want it to happen? So let's just say for now, I'm going to tell it to make the area I'm about to cover much darker. I'll just move the exposure. Well, next, I'll go out over the image. And here, I need to teach you another keyboard shortcut secret. Whenever you use this, you're going to want to hold the Shift key on the keyboard. If you hold the Shift key and then click and drag, your filter will be nice and straight. But if you don't hold the Shift key, you get this, I call it the drunken airplane effect, where it goes all over the place, all sideways. So I'll hold Shift, I'll drag it down, and you can see how that's really changing the top of the photo. So above this line, 100% change. Here at the pin, half of the change. Below this line, no different. Well, let me position this so there's a little bit of overlap with the mountain peaks. And now let me back this off to something much less obvious, something not nearly that crazy strong. Let's see. Let's set this to something like this. Let's up the contrast. Let's add a little blue. And so here what I can do is I can sculpt my sky so that I get a really powerful sky without affecting those mountains. Let's add some saturation in there. Something about like this. Let me turn this on and off for you. That's the sky as my camera saw it. That's the sky with my simulated graduated filter. I'm going to back these off. That's a little over the top. Added to it. This tool is so wonderful for your sunrise sunset photos because in our sunrise and sunset photography, we're always balancing Earth, the foreground, and the sky. I'll show you another example here. Here I have moonrise over Glacier Park. At first, I haven't set the exposure in this photo. So let me set the overall here. I might make the blacks a little darker. I might bring the whites up just a little. We'll go down in the highlights. We'll go up in the shadows. Let's get to something like this pretty quickly. Okay, but the sky here is weak. So if I was to make the whole image darker, I get a better sky and moon. But of course, I crush all the foreground. That's not what I want. So let me set this guy about back where it was. So I'm going to get my graduated filter. I'm going to double click effect. That zeroes things out. I'll just set it to darken it again. I'm going to hold the shift key, drag it down. And so now I can say above this line, I want things to get darker. I want the full effect from here up, half the effect from here up, none of the effect from here down. Well, with a little seasoning, let's go a little darker, a little bluer. Let's bring our highlights down, bring our saturation up a little. Let me hit close. Let me go comparison. Compare the detail in the face of the moon here to the detail and color in my original sky. I love this. As a landscape photographer, this is amazing. This is what I do with the physical graduated neutral density filters. But with the physical filters, I don't have nearly as much flexibility. I'm not saying I don't use them, just don't have this ability to adjust the color, the saturation, the brightness. This is where programs like Lightroom really bring so much to the table for folks like me. This graduated filter is so powerful that I thought I'd show you one more example. What I'm going to show here, though, I have to say, is not in the Lightroom cloud-based product yet. I'm sure Adobe is working on it. I'm sure it's coming, but it's just not there yet for those of you using the other type of Lightroom. What I want to show is that if I bring out the graduated filter, just like I did last time, and if I make some heavy change, just so it's blatantly obvious that I'm changing the sky, do you see how that graduated filter is also going to darken down this big towering cliff wall over here? Because the graduated filter right now is running across my entire image. Another way of seeing this is to turn on this little button down here that says show selected mask overlay. Here, all the areas in red are the areas that the filter is going to darken. Well, the problem is I don't want it to darken the cliff wall. I want it to darken only the sky. Now, there are two ways that I can refine where it works inside of Lightroom Classic. This is the part that's not in the other type of Lightroom yet. I can refine it with a brush by painting over the areas I don't want to change. Or better, I think, I can use this feature called the range mask. And what the range mask lets me do is tell Lightroom whether I want to restrict it to only affecting certain colors or certain brightnesses. Let's go with brightness. And here, I'm going to use that Alt-click trick again as I drag this slider up. And for this to make sense, understand that the area that's in black is the area that will not be changed. And the area in white is the area that will be allowed, will be affected. So basically, I'm going to make a mask for those of you with a Photoshop background so that only that area in white is where this graduated filter has its effect. Let me prove it. See how that's not affecting the cliff wall anymore? So let me set this something like this. We'll add some color. We'll add some saturation. Let me just make this pretty obvious on the screen. Before, kind of a flat, boring sunset sky. After, much more vivid, much more vibrant sunset sky and minimal effect on the cliff wall. Let's see. I see in the questions, there's a question about how do we do a graduated change in Photoshop? Well, there's two ways there. In the RAW converter, the Adobe Camera Raw engine, you'd have the exact same tool. The other option in Photoshop would be to create an adjustment layer and then add a layer mask. And with the layer mask, you could do exactly this and say here, but not there in Photoshop. All right. So for the sunset sunrise photographer, the graduated filter is a must-have. The other one that I think you're going to love in the Lightroom kingdom, and both types of Lightroom have this, is the brush tool. Why the brush tool? Well, because the brush tool allows us to paint light and color into the things that interest us. Basically, the foreground. In this photo, these rocks, they're not random in my photo. I chose to photograph here in Glacier National Park, where I teach a lot, because these rocks add so much interest to this side of the canvas. Now, I've already tuned up the overall image. Now, I just want to make these rocks pop more than they do. Well, the graduated filter is not really going to help me because it runs all the way across the canvas. So what I can do is open up the brush tool. I can set, oh, let's make these a little brighter. Let's make them a little more saturated. But now it's only going to work where I paint. So I can paint over the items that I want to change using Lightroom's brush tools. So let me paint this rock and this rock and this rock. And I'm going to do a sloppy job for the demo here. If I was doing this for real, I would be much more precise. I would zoom in, I'd slow down, I'd change my brush size. If I needed to, I would erase some of the areas I spilled on. I'm going to use that overlay mask to see the areas I spilled. But watching me carefully paint, that's boring. It's the concept here. That's what I think is important. We don't have to make a big change to these rocks. Just a little addition of contrast, of color, of brightness, maybe of warmth, and they will really shine compared to the original. Before, they're kind of muted, they're kind of in shadow, they're a little dark. After, they pop. Now, again, I've probably totally overdone it, but I think you get the idea. The brush tool is our way of emphasizing that foreground subject in your sunrise sunset photo. I'll show you one more example of this. Here, we'll go from Glacier National Park to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. These rocks along the right edge, they're my foreground. I need those to be brighter than they were when originally photographed. I need like a fill flash effect. So I'll set up the brush. In this case, I'm going to cut the flow back a little so that I don't get all of the effect in a single paint stroke. Let's just make these a little brighter, a little more saturated. And this way, by cutting the flow down, I can paint over the same area again and again to build up the thickness. Rather than a single paint stroke, this allows me to be a little more subtle as I paint light. I'm literally painting detail into these areas with the brush. We'll paint in a little detail here, a little detail there. We're basically adding light where we want the eye to go in our image. We'll paint some more detail in there. Again, I'm probably overdoing it. I'm being really fast and sloppy. If I was doing this for real, I'd slow down with a lot more precision. But let me show you what a difference before, rocks and shadow, after, rocks that shine. Cool? So as you're working in Lightroom, fix the global image first. Get rid of the dust. When you get to the more precise local stuff, since the sky is usually the dominant factor, go for the graduated tool. Next, if needed, go for the brush tool to paint in detail and light where you want it. Let me show you just one last set of examples, and then I'll stop for some questions here. So the other thing I love about Lightroom is it allows us to take more than one photo and combine them together. In this case, I have two images here that make a single panorama, right? This photo doesn't have the edge of the land, the peninsula. This one doesn't have the buildings. It's the combo of these two that gives me the scale I want for this kind of image. So by shooting two overlapping photos, the flag is my overlap point, I can use Lightroom to merge these together. So I can go photo merge, in this case, to merge two images into a panorama that looks something like this. What I love about Lightroom is that although the merging process involves one additional button, the image refinement part is absolutely no different. When I'm ready to work on this photo, the one that Lightroom created from those two puzzle pieces, I have all of the same buttons. I have all of the same features for how I tune up its brightness, for how I adjust its color, for how I adjust its intensity, the graduative filter. Nothing in here changes once I've combined my puzzle pieces together. The same is true for high dynamic range imagery, HDR, because often at sunset, one of the biggest problems we run into is the problem of brightness. So for example, in this exposure, the sky is a little too bright. The shadows are a little too dark. Let me show that histogram. See how this one has inky black to about paper white? Well, here's the inky blacks. There's about the paper whites. So I can shoot another photo that has a better sky and a better light in the lighthouse. Notice nothing up near paper white, but too much in the inky black. I can shoot a third photo. Now for this, you need a good steady tripod and a subject that's not moving, where you have good shadow detail, but of course that whole sky is blown out. So using Lightroom or other software like it, I can take these three brackets, these puzzle pieces, I can select them all, and I can merge them together into a new composite that's going to cut out the best of the sky from one image, or I should say the highlights, the best of the shadows from another, going to put them together. Let me just say merge. And again, the point being, once I've created my merge, I can then work on it using the same tools that I'm already familiar with. So let me just go to the merge here. And now I can say, use that Alt trick to set my blacks, to set my whites. Let's go to about there, bring out my shadows, bring down my highlights. I can get to an image that has a level of color and detail that no single bracket would have given me. This composite is closer to what my eye would have seen at this moment than any one click of the shutter. Just one thing to be aware of, though, because we fall in love with this HDR concept. The problem here is one of things that are moving. So you see the traffic on the freeway of Atlanta. If I combine these two brackets together into a merge, so if I merge them, at first it's going to look just fine. But the problem when things are moving around in this kind of compositing is that we get these weird holes in the image where the puzzle pieces didn't quite line up. To see this, let me create the merge. And then let me zoom in really close here. Let me make this overall a little brighter for you as well. Let's go something about like this. Oh, too bright. Let's go something about like that. When I zoom in here, though, do you see these weird chunky spots? Kind of have like a hard edge to it. That's where the puzzle pieces don't line up because the cars kept moving. I bring this up because HDR is such a seductive technique for the sunrise sunset photographer. For it to work well, you really do need fairly stationary subjects. Traffic on the freeway, probably if you look close enough, gonna have that kind of flaw. So it's great when it works, but it doesn't work all the time. One last, even less likely to work, but amazing when it does, is when you take overlapping bracketed images. So this is my dark bracket, my medium, my bright. This is an overlap, dark, medium, bright, to make a panorama out of an HDR. And in fact, Lightroom even has a command for this where it will merge the exposures first and then the overlap so that I will get a final photograph that is both wider than a single click of the shutter and has a dynamic range that goes way beyond what I could have done in a single click. The odds of this working are very, very small. We need perfect overlap and minimal motion. But it's worth knowing to me that it's possible so that in the rare case where things line up, you can get a photo like this. Obviously, I need to fine tune it, but this is the width of a wide angle shot without the distortion of the wide lens and the dynamic range of multiple images. Okay, the very last thing I want to say here is this. Lightroom is wonderful, but Lightroom is not the only program that you might turn to. Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop, or Lightroom and some other program, they play beautifully together. You can use Lightroom to fine tune your raw files, your original captures, whatever they may be. You can use Photoshop to take multiple frames and do things that Lightroom wouldn't let you do otherwise. And this is actually going to go beautifully back to a question a minute ago on how to do this kind of thing in Photoshop. So let me show you here two sunset photos. This is the Seattle skyline. I shot this one on a tripod right at what we would call golden hour. You can see the beautiful light here on the building. I didn't move the camera, didn't change anything except the settings. I waited half an hour until the world fell into twilight. Same image, but at different times of day. I love the light on the tower here. I love the blue mood to the city out here. So I can fine tune both of these images in Lightroom. In fact, I've done that to get us ready here. Then I can't combine these two together in Lightroom and say, I want the twilight here, I want the light on the building there. Unfortunately, that kind of thing, that's what Photoshop does. But Lightroom and Photoshop are meant to be teammates. They're meant to work together. It's not a one versus the other kind of world. So I can take these two tuned up files. I can then go Photo, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop, and call this my final suggestion to you. When you're shooting sunrise and sunset, sometimes the best image you can create is not a single photo, but puzzle pieces, part of this one that you'll mix with part of that one when you get home. So right now, Lightroom's going to hand off a copy of these files to Photoshop. And I'm not going to get carried away. Photoshop is a great, big, complex program, does 10,000 things. There's lots to be learned here. I just want to show you something simple. I'm going to stack these up with the the late day sun photo on top and the blue hour one underneath. There is layers. One fits on top of the other. And because they were on a tripod, they align beautifully. So in Photoshop, I'm going to add a layer mask. That's this all white box right here. Then I'll get Photoshop's equivalent to the graduated filter, the gradient tool. In the world of layer masks, where a mask is white, we see everything that's on that layer. But when the mask is black, we don't see what's on that layer. So I can take my gradient, draw out an area like this, and I'm going to have it paint black at the bottom and fade the black paint off towards the top. Let's make that extend just a little further. So now I can get the twilight blue from the photo underneath mixing with the golden hour of the photo above. If I wanted to, I could get the brush tool in Photoshop and I could paint with black paint to say, let's bring in some more of that blue twilight along in here. And let's keep some of that golden hour light on the upper buildings, something like this, combining the two together to make an image we couldn't have before. I'll go File, Save. I'll drop this back into Lightroom. And with that, I think you've seen enough to fine tune your images, I hope, using Lightroom. And if needed, an idea of what we might do to go further into Photoshop. Well, here, let me, hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully it brought some color and joy to your life. Let me bring back my video and let me pause there and say questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. You got an incredibly a lot amount of information in there. Woo! I'm out of breath from just listening. So let's start it with a question from Leanne Wood from Livestream. Leanne is asking, how do you invert the filters?
In Lightroom. In Lightroom, only one of the filters can be inverted. Let me pick this one, for example. It can be quickly inverted. Well, let me start that answer again. Apologies, Leanne. So with the graduated filter, let me just reset my brushwork here. Let me just undo the brushwork. Okay, so let me grab the graduated filter. Usually, so far in the demo, I've been setting the graduated filter to darken down the sky. If I wanted the opposite then, if I wanted to use it to brighten up the foreground, all I have to do is roll it over and then reverse it. So instead of making things darker, I would make the bottom half of the image brighter. So with the graduated filter, the inverse is simply roll it the other direction and change what you're doing with it. The other type of local adjustment tool, one that I didn't cover in this demo because usually I think of it more with portraiture, is the radial filter. The radial filter is like the graduated filter, except it works within a circle, or it has an invert button outside the circle. So now I'm saying to it, for example, here I would say darken everything in the circle. If I turn off invert, darken everything outside of the circle. So with the graduated tool, just roll it over, spin it the other way. With the radial filter, look for that invert button down there at the bottom. Hopefully that answered that question.
Wonderful. Yes, and if it didn't answer it, Leanne, just shoot us a message and let us know if there's a follow-up question you had to that. Now, Tom, who's also joining us from live stream, asks, how do you turn on the range mask?
So the range mask in Lightroom, it's tied to these three tools, the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the brush. And what you have to do is, let me just pick let me go back to this image since this is the one I demoed it on, I believe. And let me delete the work I did here. So we're starting fresh. So with the graduated filter, first set your filter. So like, let me make that whole top end of the photo way too dark, just so it's blatantly obvious. Once you have the graduated filter, the radial filter, or the brush strokes in place in Lightroom Classic, and I have to be clear there, unfortunately, this one is not in the other type of Lightroom yet. I hope Adobe is going to bring it soon, but not yet. We come down here where it says range mask, and we go from off to either color or luminance. If you pick luminance, what you're going to do is adjust this range from including all the pixels from inky black to paper white to something where you're excluding, say, the darkest pixels. So as I bring this up, you'll see how some of that image comes back because I'm saying to it, anything darker in the photo than this, on a scale where 0 is inky black and 100 is paper white, I don't want that included. Or if I go the other way, I'd be saying to it, I don't want anything brighter than, say, 70% luminance included. Let me reset this just a second here. The alternative, so luminance is one choice. The other choice, let me make this a little less dark, is to use this eyedropper for color, where you say, I want these colors or these colors, but not the other colors in the photo. So this is with no range mask. This is with a color range mask. And this would be, let me just reset that. And this would be a luminance range mask by brightness. For landscape, sunset type photos, often the luminance masking is the easiest because we have a clear difference between the brightness of the cliff wall and the brightness of those puffy clouds in the sky. Other times, the color is a great way to distinguish one from another. Just to show an example real quick of like color, if I go here, if I was to, for some reason, run the graduated filter across the bottom edge of this photo, and let me just make things brighter, something like this, I could come into the color mask and say, yeah, but what I'm really interested in brightening are just the red flowers and not any of the green behind it. And so now as I change this, hopefully the reds will get the majority of the change. Let me add a little more red there. The reds will get the change, but not as much of the greens. And to control it further, there's this amount slider where I could alt click and really narrow that down or widen it out so that there's a spread in how precise the color. You'll find it down here.
Okay. And David was asking, he says, but doing so does not show up in the reflection, or does it?
Ooh, so back here, I think.
Going back.
Yep, let me hop back one photo, apologies. So in this photo, set things back a second for us. In reality, if I was to darken the top edge, the sky, we ought to see a similar darkening in its reflection. In the real world, a reflection should always be darker than the light source. I'm going to take some artistic liberty here. I'm going to say I don't think anyone would ever notice this amount of adjustment to my sky. I don't think I'm going to get called out on this because the reflection here, I think, is close enough in brightness. But if I was to overdo this, let me just bring that up again. If I set this way too heavy, that doesn't look natural, right? Because at no time could a reflection be brighter than the light source that it's reflecting. That's not the way reflections work. So I think the answer I would give here, David, is keep it subtle. No one will notice. Overdo it, you've created something unnatural.
I'm going to second that, David. You never, everything in moderation. You never want to overdo any of your sliders, really, right?
Yeah. The art is the key, I think, is not how far can you push these things, but how little of them can you get away with, where it just gives the image some pop. It's like cooking with Tabasco sauce, right? Like if you pour the Tabasco sauce on, after a while, all we taste is Tabasco, and you drowned out the food itself. A little bit goes a long way.
Definitely. Now, Rudy's asking, I don't know how well versed you are in Photoshop Elements, but Rudy's asking if you can get similar results by using Photoshop Elements.
Ooh, I'm afraid Photoshop Elements is a weak one for me. Nothing against Elements, but simply because the money I pay Adobe each month pays for Lightroom and the full Adobe Photoshop program. So I haven't had a need to buy Elements separate from whatever I have. I think I would be willing to say everything I demoed today has an equivalent in Elements. I'm certain that there's nothing I did today that Elements can't do, but I'm afraid I can't tell you exactly where you'd find all these controls.
Yeah, I think that's an Adobe thing, is there's always 10 ways, if not more, to do every single thing that you need to do. Now, Judith is asking, yep, go ahead, David.
I was going to say, I saw Judith's question there. After you.
Oh, there you go. So Judith's asking about the transform tool. Is there a way to extend the areas that were not cropped out?
Not really, Judith. Sadly, that the way that Lightroom's transform tool works, it bends and warps the image to make it, say, vertical. Or if I was to use rotate, for example, it pivots it from the right to the left. There is a way to enlarge what you have using this scale slider, but essentially all you're doing is cropping in. What we don't have in Lightroom is the ability for it to make up new pixels out here. Now, Adobe Photoshop, not Lightroom, but Photoshop does have that capability to some extent. Photoshop could invent more grassy lawn, like in this corner. Sometimes what Photoshop invents can be really convincing. Other times, not so convincing. But sadly, that kind of inventing of pixels is not something that Lightroom has yet.
Yeah, and a good precursor to that when you're out shooting is if you are using a very wide angle lens, account for that. A lot of times, if I'm shooting at a lens that I know I'm going to have to use the transform tool on, I will shoot a little wider if the scene allows for it, because I know that I'm going to lose those pixels along the edge to reshaping the image. So whenever you think something might be skewed, try to account for it in camera if possible.
And
And
I was
we'll
going to say,
take
and that's
one.
exactly. Oh, I was going to say that's
Yep,
exactly
no,
the
go ahead.
mistake. That's exactly the mistake I've made here. My tower is too close to the top edge. I love transform, but if you don't leave enough room, not going to save you.
Yeah. And Janine says, I've nudged the X and Y offset to get just a little bit of extra sky or foreground in my image. Usually I found the same thing with the X or Y offset. You can get one or two little bumps and that's it. And if you go beyond that, you'll find yourself having to clone in some areas. But like you said, with this image here, it's going to create a lot more work if you had to clone stuff in. And I think each image is a case by case scenario where you might be able to get away with cloning in some foreground here because it's a fairly easy foreground to clone in. But once you get into a difficult scenario or the more detail you have, it can be a little more difficult.
Indeed. And you know, in this photo, I think no one's going to care about the foreground detail, bottom right, left. But if there was something interesting happening down here, more variation in the rocks, something fascinating, my skills are, my limited skills are with the camera. I have no skills as a graphic design or painter. So what I can create is not going to look good.
Hey, that's knowing what your limitations are as far as what you can do in post is huge because I think the goal is to get it right in camera as much as possible and really use the post processing. Like you didn't show us anything here where you were taking a completely horrible image and reshaping it. You were taking solid images and just putting the finishing touches on them.
Well, first, I appreciate Derek. Thank you so much. What I would say is I've picked out examples here out of the hundreds and thousands of lousy photos that I looked at and said, that's not worth working on. And that's not worth working on. And that's not even in focus. And, what did I do wrong there? That to me, the fun is going out with my camera, shooting a bunch of images, the best I can, coming home, picking out the best of the bunch and seeing, can I take that even further? Can I make it more interesting? And
Definitely.
You don't need to see
hey,
the loser. You don't need to see the losers out of the.
We all have them, David. I got hard drives full of losers over here. Got them stacked up and organized. We're going to take one last question. Again, we're getting a lot of comments coming in saying just excellent job. I think you laid this out perfectly, David. I am not a Lightroom person. And every time we have a Lightroom webinar, my gauge is, did I understand it? Am I able to walk away with something? And you showed me some stuff here that I hadn't seen before. It was just really just a simple, easy to digest format. So we want to thank you for that. Our final question comes from Tom, again on live stream. What does the effect button do in the graduated filter?
Well, what the effect button does, let me just pause my video for a second here. So in the various tools, let me go to this photo, apologies, just so we have something fresh on the screen. The effect button does two things for us, essentially. First, let me, in fact, take the graduated filter away that's there. If you double click on the word effect, let me set all these sliders to something crazy. When you double click effect, it zeroes all the sliders out. So in essence, it's the reset button before we've done anything with the filter. To be clear, if I do something and I don't like what I've done, I have a reset here that takes the whole filter away. but the effect just zeroes these sliders back out. So it doesn't take the filter away, it just sets them back to zero. The other thing that the effect slider does is it lets you pick a preset for the sliders. So for example, if we were doing like portrait retouching, because we have the same menu for the graduated filter, the radial filter, the brush filter, this would give us a brush designed for whitening the teeth, or this would give us a set of sliders that make things lighter. This would give us sliders that make things darker. So double clicking here is a reset of these controls. Clicking here allows you to pick a preset for these controls.
Wonderful. Well, you guys know where to find him. If you look up davidmarx.com, focusphotoschool.com, Google it, check out Focus Photo School's YouTube channel. It's so easy now to find people. It's the information age. It's great, but definitely support David's work. I showed you where you can find some more stuff earlier on in the presentation, but David, it's great having you back and really tying this whole sunrise, sunset thing full circle with the processing end of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you to everyone at B&H. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. You know, it's just so much fun for me to go out, get up early, shoot sunrise, stay out late, shoot sunset. It's the part of photography I enjoy the most, both in the field and at home when I'm working on my photos. I hope it brings you great joy and success too.
I can't close out any better than that. Thank you to all of our viewers. Another thank you to David for the wonderful presentation. We will catch y'all next time on another rendition of the B&H virtual event space. We'll catch y'all next time.